Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 96th video in our Master Series and the 10th video in our subgroup mixing. I hope you enjoyed that video on support tracks, and I hope I made that as simple as possible so that you try to keep that process as simple as possible. And that way, that when you get into mixing, that if you go back and have to fix things or adjust things, that the basic setup you've laid out, that just maybe needs some fine tuning as you get into the mixing. Now, as we get into backing tracks, the first thing you're probably going to run into with backing tracks is a couple scenarios. Either you want, let's say you've got a small composition of instruments. You've got an out front vocalist, a bass player, a guitar player, and a drummer, or say for a really simple example. Now sometimes it may sound, you either want it to sound hyper clean, which you probably wouldn't want to do this, or you kind of want to fill it out a little bit. Now, if that's all you have to work with, then a really cool way whenever you're dealing with a small complement of instruments is doubling the tracks and making groups out of them and doing this technique. This is a really cool technique to help you fill it out and make the production sound fatter. So let's say that you have the guitar, you've recorded the guitar, and you plan on panning the guitar off to the left. You've set, it's where it's going to get panned to and where its settings are. It's going to get panned left 65. Now, whereas the bass is right 65 or something. Now, in this kind of situation, that if you're shooting for hyper clean, that you may not even want to fuss with that. You may want to really limit your processing to make it sound as hyper clean as possible and really focus on doing a really good job of your processing on that individual guitar. Now, one thing that you can do is to fatten it up a little bit on that. You can double that track, or you've mic'd it with two different microphones. You've on the second track that it's been captured with a different really good microphone, or you've processed it to sound like it's captured from a really good microphone, and you can pan it off there somewhere else. So like you can have one of them panned off 75, or let's say 85, left, and maybe 65 left or something like that. And it's going to add depth and body to it. And it's if you go back to looking at some of the techniques we did when we were doubling tracks in out front tracks, that you can do some of that processing, detune the second track a little bit, you can even actually add a little bit of delay, one of the multiples we talked about on that second track with different processing on it, or captures through a different microphone, that is going to fatten the sound up. So it's over on the left hand side, but it's really fattened it up, and made it sound, one of them sounds rich and warm and thick, while the other one sounds a little brassier or something like that, as a really simple example. And that can really take a simple composition or a simple complement of instruments that you have to work with and really fatten up the production so that it sounds a lot fatter. And sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. There's been times that I will do that, and there's sometimes I don't do that, or I might change it up for different sections. So at one section I might do that, and at another section I might not. Does that make sense? During the chorus or something, where you got some harmonies going on, I might not do that. But during the verse, I might do it to add more, body to it while there's just the main out front vocal going. So that's one thing that you can really do, and I hope I made that really clear so there's not, any so it's not complicated. It's really simple, and a lot of times one or the other you might want to turn down a little bit. Normally the one closer into center, whichever one that is, you can turn it down. I start in intervals of 3 dB. I'll go 3, 6, 9 and things like that, because it's aspects you don't want as much. You want the one farther off. It's got, characteristics you want to sound a little more brassier. That's the one you did your first processing on it, and you're most happy with that one. The other one's a little thicker and darker and richer, and you've got that one scooted in a little bit farther, to like 65, left or something like that, but turned down 3 dB or 6 dB or 9 dB. That's adding just body to it, and it's got detuned a little bit or uptuned a little bit, and it's got a little bit of delay on it. Mess with the multiples of delay until you find one that doesn't start sounding phasey. Sometimes that's just, in every situation, that just takes work. So that's one way. Another way is that you can take that track and you've captured the other one with a different really nice microphone, or you've processed the sound a little bit different. You've put a little bit of detuning on it, maybe a little bit of delay on it. And you can take this one, let's see, you've got this one panned out left 65. And the other one that you pan right 65. Now, the concept here is really cool because this one that's panned left 65, you've left pretty loud. And we'll get into changing that, how that goes into the mix later. We're not too worried about levels. But the other one that's over onto the right side is basically over where the bass is going to be played because you want the guitar left. So the concept here is you turn it down. Over the one on the right hand side one, you turn it down either 3 dB, 6 dB, 9 dB, 12 dB in reduction and level, to where you hear the guitar on the left. You know, if you solo it by itself, you'll hear it over on the right a lot. But once you start mixing the bass into it, that you've got the left on the guitar and the right on the bass, as a simple example, that you don't really hear the guitar over on the right hand side where the bass is, but it is there. And so what's going to happen, but it's not real audible, and it's way down below the level of the bass, but it's adding thickness and richness. You've detuned it a little bit, you've put some delays over on that side, but you've brought the level down like to, minus 12 dB or minus 9 dB or minus 6 dB, to where the bass is riding up above it, but it's adding width. Does that make sense? So it can make, you've got this small complement of instruments, and it's another way to make it sound fatter, so that it sounds like there's more going on than there normally is, because it's really hard to reproduce that live. You can nowadays, if you're an engineer and you do things like this, you can do things like this live, but a lot of times they used to not be able to do that. And you can do this in the studio, and it can make a really simple complement of instruments sound really fat and thick. And do the same thing with the bass. If you got the bass over on the right, you can double the track, or you've got a different microphone, a real nice microphone you've captured that you panned off to the right, that's way down and level beneath the guitar, that just adds this fatness. Because the only thing you've got is the out front vocal, the guitar and the bass, and the drummer. I mean, it's a simple band. Does that make sense? And you might have a pad synth behind that basically you got the synth player that you've got him to where he's right and left at different pannings that just make the whole production sound really full and thick and rich and lush, and add all this body to it. Unless you're shooting for a really hyper clean sound, to where you may do some of those things that I'm talking about here, but back way off on it. So whatever that double track is, that its level is brought way down to try to really, keep things sounding hyper clean as possible. And, if you're really shooting for one of those in your face, hyper clean kind of sounds. But it's a really cool technique, and it's a very simple technique to really help. Now, this can be, during this scenario, these tracks are very questionably whether they're supporting or backing tracks, and they might be filling both those roles to some point. Does that make sense? Because you don't have a whole lot of other things that are support behind a very simple complement of instruments, like a rock band or a reggae band, or a real simple jazz band or something like that, that you don't have all that stuff to play with to create all that depth and width and body in your production. That those two techniques can really help you do that. And like I said, they just take experimentation. The concept is really simple, and I try to state it as simply as possible, so I don't make it really complicated, so you don't go, oh, and then by how much of a percentage, and then by how many exact dB, and things like that. Normally I work in, set increments, 3, 6, 9, something like that, and then I start fine-tuning it from there. Does that make sense? That way that I don't get lost in, in mathematics, and when I'm trying to figure that out, but, subdividing it to where it's something simple to work with. And then you just have to experience what it might sound good in this production. That the guitar and the bass that sound good, and I've got the guitar that I've got one left where I want it, and the one that I doubled or captured with a different microphone, I've got over to the right, but I've got it like minus 12 dB, underneath the bass over there, just to add thickness to it and add width to it, with the delays and the tunings on that other guitar, and it just sounds yap. Now, different production, it might be minus 6 dB, it might be minus 9, it might even be minus 3, depending on, what sounds good or what my personal taste is for that in that certain production, or my personal taste period of how I think that should sound and how loud it should be, or how much I want to add into that to obtain the type of effect that I want. But the basic understanding is that's to try to fatten up your production a little bit, so that if you've got a simple production that doesn't have a large complement of instruments, that you can really make it sound, compensate for the lack of frequency field content that you have by fattening out the stereo field that way. That's going to make it sound a lot thicker and richer. And on top of it, with a little bit of different processing on that second track, like we talked about, that it is going to enrich the spectral field also to some point. Does that make sense? Which is going to help in both those areas to make your simple complement of instruments in a simple production sound fatter and bigger. So that's a very simple concept, and I'm trying not to get it really complicated. I'll leave that concept about just like that. There's lots of variations, and as we go through this and we get through all this, you might go back and apply different concepts that I've talked about or talked about in mixing concepts, but it's a very simple concept to help you just fatten up your sound in a simple production when you don't have a large instrument complement. So peace, soap, love. I hope you enjoyed this video, the first video on our backing tracks. And in this video, it's kind of, these might be seen as backing and supportive tracks all in one, in a way to really help you, fill out the spectrum and fill out the stereo field to try to make it a little bit fatter in sounding and richer and things like that, to try to make, the production sound as good as possible. So peace, soap, love. I hope you enjoyed this first video on our backing tracks, and I will see you in the next video.